Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
So the separation of the two is something that has to be done with intention.
Yes.
And then also recognizing Black history also needs to be done with some intention.
Real people lived in these communities.
To be erased is a powerful motivator.
I'm Elaine Chow. In 1926, Carter G. Woodson and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History launched the first Black History Week. 50 years later, President Gerald Ford made Black History Month a period of national observance. We're now in 2023. What exactly is the Black history being recognized and celebrated by schools, institutions, organizations, and even businesses in the U.S.? And who has done the research, curation, and interpretation of Black history that happens in formal settings and in everyday life, especially at a time when the value and validity of certain kinds of history are being challenged? Joining me in studio to talk about it, we have three guests. Cicely Hunter, public historian for the African American History Initiative at the Missouri Historical Society. Welcome.
Thank you.
We also have Vivian Gibson, author of the award-winning and truly memorable memoir, The Last Children of Mill Creek. Welcome to you as well.
Thank you.
And Pam Sanfilippio, Program Manager, Museum Services and Interpretation at the Gateway Arch National Park. Welcome to you, Pam.
Good afternoon.
Thank you all for being here today. Cicely, let's start with the basics. What does it mean to interpret history?
Yes, so I see interpreting history, especially as it pertains to Black experiences, is one in which we sometimes have to read against the archive. And so by that, I mean that, oftentimes these histories about Black people have been told from white perspective or perspective that's not necessarily Black people. And when that happens, a lot of times we have to read against that narrative that puts us as a subjected people and things of that nature to really craft a story of lived experience that is indicative of Black people, that is, of course, about, things like the Black freedom struggle, but also about Black joy and Black experiences. And I think that's what's most important about interpreting history, is that we got to be more strategic in our emphasis that looks not just from the dominant narrative, but looks truly at Black life.
Mm-hmm. So it's looking at what is present and what is also then absent, not because it wasn't there, but because there wasn't attention being paid to it. Would you say that?
Exactly.
So Vivian, the historical interpretation process sounds a lot like, collecting pieces of a puzzle that have been scattered all over the place in an effort to create sort of a clear picture of people in a place at a certain time. And an obvious example might be to look at newspaper clippings and relying on those, which present something and not a lot of other things, as you've mentioned, Cicely. And it shows perhaps a skewed side of the story. As you were writing your memoir about your childhood home of Mill Creek Valley, which was an historically Black neighborhood here in St. Louis that was razed in 1959 for, quote, industrial redevelopment, how did you find those pieces of history to complete your book?
That's a good question because, as Cicely pointed out, there wasn't always good information, say, in the newspapers or even in the museum archives or libraries. It was simply left out. And even today in newspaper.com to get articles, you can't find Black newspapers, which amazes me today. And in pictorials for even at the History Museum, you don't always find pictures of Black life or certainly not Black joy. If you put in Mill Creek, you find houses that have been demolished once things were starting to be torn down, but you can't find a neighborhood when we've been described as a slum. Mm-hmm. And all the pictures that you see are of that. Fortunately, it was a memoir, and I had some of my family information. But I was 10 years old when Mill Creek was demolished. So I had to do a lot of research about what was going on in society at that time, and certainly in Mill Creek. Mm-hmm. And it was not easy.
And where did you do that research?
I did a lot of it at the History Museum. I did a lot of articles from the Post-Dispatch and the Globe Democrat and the St. Louis Star. But I had to read that because it was skewed. Mm-hmm. So a lot of that, and then, of course, the Black newspapers. Just history, period, about what was going on with urban renewal at the time, politics in the city, in the nation, mm-hmm. That sort of thing. So,
now, Pam, you are at the Gateway Arch National Park, and that is a form of official history, and it's part of an institution. There's this saying that is attributed to Winston Churchill, that history is written by the victors. Do you find that to be true in the kind of history that you have been sort of responsible for helping to interpret and to present, particularly at the Gateway Arch site?
I think historically that would be true as far as the traditional records that researchers looked at. What we've been able to do is kind of delve a little further, and that it's going on across the nation, of course, in museums and history departments throughout the country, to really things that were there before. What consensus records tell us about where people were living, what their incomes were, more about them. And so using oral histories, which traditionally were not used as official records, and blending all of those together, and then going to the actual people who lived that history mm-hmm. to tell those stories as well.
And do you get some of that from those who come to visit the museum?
Sometimes it's going out and searching for that. We've been very fortunate. We're working on new exhibits for the old courthouse where Dred and Harriet Scott first sued for their freedom, along with 300 other freedom suits that were held at the old courthouse. And we're very fortunate that the great-great-granddaughter of Dred and Harriet Scott lives here in St. Louis, Lynn Jackson, and so she's been instrumental in sharing some of her family stories about her great-great-grandparents.
So the extent to which people are integral to telling and remaking sometimes history certainly seems to be something that is coming out from the things that you've said, both Vivian and Pam. Cicely, if we put things sort of in another way, whose versions of Black history have had the most purchase in this country?
So who have had the most purchase in this country?
Whose versions of history have been held up as the version, like the authoritative versions of Black history?
Yeah, so I of course like to point to Black scholars and folks who have lived the experience, because I think that that's truly where the real stories come in, and that's what shapes our understanding in a full and complete way. So, I go back to some books that I read from the 60s. Like, it's kind of crazy where I'm thinking about, like the civil rights movement with MLK, and how, at one point in time, there was even talk about, well, they're just aimless crowds kind of wandering, right? But they weren't. They were very organized and strategic. And this organization stretched back for, hundreds and thousands of years, right? Mm-hmm. And so just thinking about that and coming to the understanding that there are scholars that have been doing this work and continue to do the work, and there are people who have lived the history and can tell the story in profound ways.
And so, Vivian, in terms of what you have observed since the time you began researching for the memoir that you've written and what is going on now, do you feel like there has been significant change in who's telling stories? And I mean, what is happening with the restoration of the old courthouse? Maybe is that an example? What do you think?
Well, it's been a short time. My book came out in 2020, so I can't really point to a significant change in that short time. But over time, certainly, I've seen a change. And to go back to Cicely's point, Black newspapers probably have been the source of Black history for certainly Black people and anyone else interested. And again, it's hard to find archives of even Black newspapers. So I think my experience talking about this book and how much interest there is in what I wrote, I think I see a change. Mm-hmm. For sure. I'm talking to students at even the middle school level and the college level and book clubs and corporations. So there seems to be a heightened interest, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that we did do before this conversation happening was some engagement. And our producer, Maya Norfleet, she posed a question to our online audience. Who taught you Black history? Where did you learn Black history? And when did you first start learning about Black history? So I am not someone who is from St. Louis. I was born and raised in Canada. So I didn't get much even about First Nations history when I was growing up through the 80s. One of the people who did respond to that call for engagement is someone who did grow up in Missouri. This person was a guest on our program previously, Marie Enger, and they shared that their mom, who is a history teacher, got them started as a child and got a little Black history in primary school. And they tweeted, quote, "I learned what I know now from the people around me and how to research what I didn't know from activists, that is, both online and in real life. And if not from my friends, colleagues, and community, I'd be stuck with a 7th grade Black history education." Again, that's coming from Marie Enger on Twitter. Cicely, in hearing that, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, so when you read that quote, I think what I immediately went to is that, when we talk about American history, U.S. history, I really think it is Black history. In so many ways, I think that people think of them as disjointed, but they're very much interwoven and interconnected. And that's the power of Black experience and Black history, is that these things are not separated. They're not, they're not divorced, right? But they're integral and they're interconnected, interwoven. All of those things that are complex speak to Black experience, Black life, and alike. So that's just kind of what comes to mind for me.
We're going to take a short break here, but we are going to come back very shortly. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. We are returning now to our conversation about Black history and its interpretation with 3 local historians, Cicely Hunter, Vivian Gibson, and Pam Sanfilippio. So Pam, the museum at the Gateway Arch saw some recent renovations that were unveiled in 2018, and there's been also the renovation of the old courthouse. Now, can you provide a concrete example of a piece of history that is going to be interpreted differently with this old courthouse renovation?
Sure. The Park Service, part of the reason that the old courthouse is part of Gateway Arch National Park is because of the story of Dred and Harriet Scott. And at that time, it was just Dred Scott who was important in 1935. So we've told that story for many years. But with these new exhibits, we'll have an entire gallery dedicated to the story of Dred and Harriet Scott, including both of them and their family. But the emphasis is changing in that we're telling it more from their perspective. Previously, the Park Service would tell the story from, the court cases as they came and the decisions that were made by the judges. Now we're looking at, their lives, how they met and got married, and then their experiences, and them making this decision to file the suit. So just, enriching that story, as Cicely was saying, looking at the people themselves.
And before the break, we had talked about the tweet that had come in about school, and I'm imagining that the old courthouse is a place that children come to visit or go to visit with their classes in a very formal way, and then also with their families and members of their different communities. Cicely, do you think that this is a sign of progress?
Yes, absolutely. And I also think, Vivian's amazing book, we also will have an exhibit that focuses on Mill Creek Valley. Gwen Moore, the curator of urban landscape and community identity, is developing that. So just seeing the ways that we're really bringing out stories of experience that, at one point was deemed like, it's a throwaway thing, right? It's not really as important. You got urban renewal and blight and things like that. But now we're seeing like, no, real people lived in these communities and they built communities. There were businesses, there were churches, there were schools, right? This was an active community. And so we're beginning to see these stories really come to life in so many different ways. And it's been going on for years.
Mm-hmm. And it's coming from different places. Yes, Pam.
And what I love about it is then it helps us understand how we got to where we are today. That relevance to me is just crucial for, well, gosh, if that community was there, what happened to it? Where did those people go? Where are they living at today? Those connections are so crucial.
And Pam, oftentimes history is seen as these sort of spectacular or monumental events. But the slices of life, that you were talking about, Cicely, and that you've also mentioned, Vivian, that is very much what makes community a living thing. What stories about everyday life will be provided to offer another interpretation and understanding of history?
Sure. Across from this gallery dedicated to Dred and Harriet Scott, we'll have a gallery called Pathways to Freedom that talks about African American life in St. Louis from its founding. And so, helping people understand that until post-Civil War, really, African Americans and whites were integrated in the communities. There are many reasons for that, but it wasn't until after that, after Reconstruction, that you start seeing the segregated communities. So again, how did we get here today?
Yeah, and that reminds me also, Cicely, of what you were saying about like American history is Black history. So the separation of the two is something that has to be done with intention.
Yes.
And then also recognizing Black history also needs to be done with some intention, right? Vivian, St. Louis has a new Major League Soccer club, and St. Louis SC has announced plans to build various public art installations and memorials that are dedicated to Mill Creek Valley, and that's along the 1 mile of the Brickline Green, which stretches from Harris Stowe State University going east to the St. Louis SC Stadium. Are plans like this part of what you were hoping for when you wrote your book? and that is like to have larger institutions finally recognize what happened to Mill Creek Valley and honor its legacy?
I can honestly say that that's what I was hoping for. I was hoping to humanize the people in Mill Creek, to tell the story of everyday people and what our community was about. But certainly having a monument or monuments that are going to stretch this distance starts a conversation. And I think that's important. Segregating and displacing 20,000 people and putting up a monument 60 years later, that's a little bit of an imbalance. Mm-hmm. But if it starts a conversation, if children who come there ask questions about how did this happen, where are these people, where did they go, how did they end up here, it's a start.
Yeah. Well, I could say as a parent, if I were at the St. Louis City SC, right at the stadium, mm-hmm. and my son saw that and asked me those questions, I certainly would not have all the answers. So I'd be looking to folks like you to mm-hmm. help me get that education. Is there some more work that you would like to see done, Vivian?
Absolutely. This is the first conversations I've ever heard about Mill Creek so publicly. I don't know if it was the timing with COVID, the book coming out, and people having time to read and discuss and reflect. But we have a long way to go. Mm-hmm. And certainly young people are going to be the answer to making the change. And they can't make changes if they don't know the history.
Mm-hmm. Now, one place people will go for history is the Missouri History Museum. And Cicely, insofar as what people can find at the Missouri History Museum, what would you recommend to someone who visits there and is specifically interested in learning more about the Black experience?
Absolutely. So there are 3 branches that exist within the Missouri Historical Society. The what's called the LRC, the Library and Research Center. We have the History Museum, and then we also have a Soldiers Memorial. It's a military museum. So I would say by visiting those particular sites, you can learn more about your community in which you lived in. Oftentimes people's houses and where, like the general vicinity of where they live and where they go to school, where they go to church, right? Like that's a powerful example of seeing what was there before and what's there now. And then I would also say programming. Like we always have programming going on. We have our Thursday nights at the museum. We are in the full swing of Black History Month right now. We will have programming that will focus on African American history as it relates to St. Louis at least once a month during our Thursday nights. But we always have things going on. We would love for people to come and tap in and have dialogue and discussion so that we can continue to progress as a city mm-hmm. and as a region.
I want to ask a more personal question. What is it about history that interests you? So, Pam, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I consider myself more of a social cultural historian. I am not a military historian. And it is those stories of people. And because there are so many things that connect us rather than divide us. I had the great pleasure years ago to work with the History Museum on a project they did on Through the Eyes of a Child, and it looked at 4 historically Black communities in St. Louis. And that's when it really opened my eyes. I thought, am I qualified to be doing this as a white historian? But through that project, it connected me more for those shared stories. We recently did a teacher workshop that Vivian participated in, and also Amanda Clark from the History Museum, to share with teachers these stories too, so that they can share with their students. So that's what I love, sharing those stories and feeling connected.
Certainly, family, history. To be erased is a powerful motivator. And I think that's the case in a lot of African American history in communities around our country is that the stories have been suppressed and simply not told. And had I not written this book, it could very easily be that Mill Creek would have just been erased, because I'm in my 70s and people are in their 80s and 90s. Once we're gone, if nobody's talking about Mill Creek, nobody will know. And I hear that all the time. I didn't know. Where was it? And I'm amazed that it was the heart of downtown, and people are saying to me today they've never heard of it.
Mm-hmm. And there was, I think, an anecdote that you had shared with our producer, Maya Norfleet, about where a cousin lived, and that what is there now
is a parking lot, just a surface parking lot, a fence and asphalt.
Right. So, I mean, that the juxtaposition of where people lived and what is now no longer there is extremely powerful. Cicely, what is it about history that makes you feel more alive or attached to life now?
So for me, it's being able to understand how the past reflects the future. And, historians have talked about how, in order to understand the present moment, you have to be able to look back from where you came, right? And I think that that's what history allows me to do. It allows me to see what's happening in our present moment, but also thinking in the long term about, well, what does that mean for our young people that are to come, generations to come, long and, far beyond when I'm gone? What is it going to look like for our young people in the future? And I think that's what motivates me, is being able to see that through line that exists.
Do you think that people are a little bit more interested in history now personally? I mean, one of the things that we got from that engagement call out was from someone named Corey Hinton, and he tweeted that learning about Black history in particular, said, for me, it started with first grade with coloring sheets on Tubman, Truth, Henson, and King. And while I might have had teachers delve into it in units outside February, it wasn't until college where I took classes to fulfill a Black Studies minor. So that is another level of commitment, certainly. There's so much left out of the U.S. history books. Court, thank you for sharing those thoughts. And again, to this point about interest in history, do you think that there is more interest in history maybe now than a few years ago?
I think it's easier to research history now. You spoke earlier about seventh grade history. When I was in seventh grade, Black history was George Washington Carver, period. I didn't study African American history until college. And we were fighting for that. I was in college in 1967, and we boycotted to get African American studies courses. So you can all thank me.
Well, and that paved the way to fight for a lot of different Americans' experience and history, right? Where do you think we are headed? So, Cicely, knowing what we know now, what expectations do you have for the way Black history should be interpreted in the future?
I think that we're definitely moving in the right direction. That, as I spoke about earlier with my first comment, reading against the archive, that's where the work lies. And also the lived experience is also important to consider. So I think we're heading in the right direction. We just got to keep working it.
Pam Sanfilippo is Program Manager in Museum Services and Interpretation at the Gateway Arch National Park. Vivian Gibson is the award-winning author of the memoir, The Last Children of Mill Creek. And we also have Cicely Hunter, public historian for the African American History Initiative at the Missouri Historical Society. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
If you'd like to share your story on learning history, especially Black history, leave us a voicemail on our dedicated voicemail line at 314-516-6397. That's 314-516-NEWS. And you can also engage with me and the producers of St. Louis on the Air on our new Facebook group. Just search for St. Louis on the Air on Facebook and select the public group that has a collage of our previous guests.
This episode was produced by Maya Norfleet.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. Our production intern is Avery Rogers. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.